Welcome to Next Economy Now. I'm Ryan Honeyman, a partner at Lyft Economy. Lyft is an impact consulting firm whose mission is to create, model, and share a locally self-reliant economy that works for the benefit of all life. The goal of this podcast is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, democratic, transparent, and whole systems approach to using business as a force for good. Our guest today is Vincent Stanley, Director of Philosophy at Patagonia and a visiting fellow at the Yale School of Management. If you've been following Next Economy Now, you might notice that Vincent is the fourth person we have interviewed from Patagonia since his podcast was launched in the fall of 2015. It's no secret that we really love this company. Not surprisingly, our listeners do too. For instance, our interviews with Phil Graves, Managing Director of Tin Shed Ventures, which is Patagonia's venture capital arm, Rick Ridgeway, VP of Environmental Initiatives, and Rose Marcario, Patagonia's President and CEO, are the top 3 most listened to episodes of Next Economy Now of all time. So what have Vincent and I discussed today? Here are some of the highlights. For example, we discussed things like how he grew up in the 60s in the San Francisco Bay Area and went to an alternative high school in the Santa Cruz Mountains. We discussed how an economic collapse, a car wash, and a postcard from his grandmother led to Vincent working at Patagonia. We also talk about Jonathan Rose's book, The Well-Tempered City. We talk about Bryn Smith of Greenwave and 3D ocean farming. And finally, at many conferences that Vincent attends, people often say to him, "I love your company, but how can we scale what Patagonia does to other industries?" His answer to this question is very fascinating for me. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Vincent Stanley. Vincent, welcome to the show.
It's good to be here.
Thanks. So I'd like to start perhaps at the beginning. I actually don't know where you were born and raised, and the Vincent Stanley before Patagonia. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your life before Patagonia came into your life.
Well, there wasn't much of it because I started at Patagonia when I was before I was 21. But I did grow up in the Bay Area in the 60s and went to an alternative high school up in the Santa Cruz Mountains called Pacific High School, and then helped edit a newsletter. My mentor was a writer named Peter Marin, and he and I worked on a newsletter on alternative education. And all that was going well, except the economy crashed, and I ended up at the age of 20 working in a car wash in Southern California in January. Not a lot of hours. And I got a postcard from my grandmother. English was her second language, saying, "Why don't you ask your uncle for a job? I hear he pays his men $2.25 an hour." So my uncle was Yvon Chenard, and he had the little climbing equipment company down in Ventura, about half an hour from where I live. So I went to work for him, intending to stay 6 months, and almost 44 years later, I've been there most of that time.
Wow. And so your grandparents were French Canadian, is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
And so I was Yvon started as a teenager making pitons in his backyard, the coal-fired forge. So I was very familiar with all that from the age of six or seven. And he was my hero as this person who was a blacksmith and doing these climbs in Yosemite and living a very simple life.
And
in those days?
Were you a climber as well?
No, I never became a climber, and I never became a surfer. The company did really influence me. I came to appreciate the power of the mountains and being more than a mile from the road, and so I love that time now. But it actually helped advance my career that as a non-surfer, I actually answered the phones. And so they came to me after about 6 months and said, we think you ought to be sales manager. So, which is what I did for about 20 years. So
availability to take the calls is a key metric, a
that's
key
right.
means of success in the early days.
That's right. It
Um,
was.
so I have a funny question or an interesting question. Who is a better rock climber? Is it Rick Ridgeway or Yvonne?
I have no idea. I've never, I've never watched Rick climb. Emal was an amazing climber to watch. Um, and I did take a couple of lessons from him on the rock, and one from Henry Barber, who was our East Coast rep, who was a major climber at the time, but it never stuck. So.
And one of the things I've asked, I mentioned to Vincent before our call that he's the fourth Patagonian that I've interviewed. And I've asked this to each of the past few folks is, do you have any funny Yvonne stories you would like to share? The one I have for you is I remember he was doing an interview, I think it was with Tom Brokaw, and he was talking about how these climbers go to Mount Everest and like the Nepalese Sherpas push them up and pull them up. And so they're assholes when they go up and then they're assholes when they get back.
That's right.
Do you have any funny Yvonne stories along the similar?
There's another funny story but most of the funny stories I know involve Ridgeway. So he may have told them to you already. There was a great scene where National Geographic sponsored a trip into an area of Bhutan that had never been explored, and at the end of they basically mapped it out, and then at the end of the trip agreed that among themselves that they would burn the map, so it would remain terra incognita. So.
Nice, that's amazing. So, turning to your work, you're working at Yale at the Yale School of Management. Mm-hmm. We've spoken in the past about regenerative capitalism. There's a lot of topics that you've probably are starting to see in the world. Is there anything that you're particularly excited about right now that you're seeing emerging in this sort of business for good space?
Yeah, there are two things that I find very interesting right now. And one of them is something that the company is really involved with because we've got our start in the food business. We have Patagonia Provisions. And the idea, I mean, you've had several people from Patagonia, so you know our story, and that along the line, we've made several accidental discoveries of the harm we were doing, particularly in the supply chain. And so we have gone to great lengths to figure out what we were doing wrong and then to make improvements. But all of that is kind of an accidental stumbling along the way. And with Provisions, we have a chance to actually start from scratch with every product we make. We look at the supply chain. We are very careful that every product actually represents some kind of innovation in the food business. The other thing that we've discovered, there are a lot of studies now that show that if you actually restore farmland to health, reducing tillage, reducing inputs, and by planting, when you're planting grains, deeper rooted grains, that you can reduce the water usage by 60%. You also bring to life the micronutrients in the soil, so that you need fewer inputs, even if they're natural. But the other tremendously exciting thing is the potential to sequester carbon that this farmland is showing. So I find that development really interesting, because if you look at all the major elements of the environmental crisis, soil is actually one of the few things that we can really do something about over a quick period. The other thing that I'm excited about at the moment is a book by Jonathan Rose, who's a green developer of low-cost housing in New York City, who's written a book called The Well-Tempered City. And he uses what Bach did for music, which was to, with the well-tempered clavier, is basically to make it possible to unify several different systems of tonality and to bring it into to harmony. And he's looking at that as a metaphor for what needs to be done with the city. So I think of those two things, one for agriculture, one for the city. Also, what Brent Smith is doing with Green Wave, and in terms of aquaculture and the potential for revitalized. We're looking with agriculture at the potential for revitalized regions and communities, and then I think with the city, we're also looking at helping to make the city a place that people really feel they belong to, that they feel that they're a citizen of, that they can help, that they have agency and can help make changes. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, what I'm looking at now is what I like.
If we were to take those two in turn, the this idea of the city, the harmonious, or making people feel welcome or belong. Can you explain a little bit more about Jonathan Rose's philosophy and why that resonates?
The tone of the book is quite calm, quite forward-looking, but also comprehensive in its vision for how cities of the future might work. He took the title, the Well-Tempered City, based it a kind of metaphor for what Bach did with the well-tempered clavier, in which Bach took the former system of tuning was based on Pythagoras and was aligned to the music of the spheres, and it was all very elegant, the exact ratios of the distances of the planets between the notes. But the only problem is if you played anything in a different key, it sounded terrible. So it was a very elegant system with huge limitations. And in Bach's time, a couple of people had done this before. They had just slightly changed the tuning so that you could actually, if you put it between the notes, then you could accommodate different keys. And the well-tempered clavier was he used all 24 sets of tones. And I think it's a great metaphor for what we need in cities, which is to get away from what has been a rather remarkable time of technology and developing the kind of urban metropolises that have never been created before, but to bring a sense of tempering to them, a sense of balance. A couple of things he works with an idea that John Fullerton has raised with regenerative capitalism, and that we continually see at Patagonia, is that if you can find, people call them different things, say a catalyst or a leverage point, but give you an example. Cities that plant trees, just planting trees along a block, just plant a row of trees. It reduces the temperature 6 degrees in the summer. It filters the air and reduces air pollution. To some extent, it offsets carbon. And there's tremendous, there are all these studies that indicate that people are really happier when they live in sight of trees. So you do one thing and it achieves 4 or 5 different ends. There was another example that he mentioned in the book. The city of Philadelphia had a really decrepit drainage system. And the EPA came in and they said, listen, this is dangerous. You're going to have your entire stormwater system. You're going to have to spend $8 billion and replace all the pipes. And it's going to be under every city in the street, and it will take you years to do it, but we're mandating it, and you've got to go ahead. So Philadelphia took that information. They went back and they said, we don't have $8 billion. This is a huge amount of money. We're going to disrupt the city for years. So what they did is they came back with a plan that they proposed to the EPA. And they said, listen, let us convert a lot of parking lots to permeable asphalt. So that will help drainage. Let's give some money for rooftop gardens. That will also help out. Let's build some parks Uh, let's replace the asphalt in schoolyards with turf. And the system that they came up with cost $1.4 billion, created a much greener city, and it's something that the EPA accepted. So it's this line of thinking, I think, that is really important for public policy, but it's also important for businesses. And it also shows where business has an opportunity when we align our values with the things that actually need to be done for society and for the environment over the next 35 years.
I love that example. I always felt weird about doing carbon offsets when I flew in an airplane. And in
Yeah,
San Francisco, they have this program called Friends of the Urban Forest, where you would plant trees infilling trees in the city. And I
yeah,
always felt like, why donate carbon credits to some
yeah.
random
No,
project? It's like you could just put more trees in your own city. So I love
yeah,
that.
that's a great idea. I think I'm going to do that for mine that you've given me because I've had the same trouble with it. I think it's such an abstract thing to do, and you don't really know where it's going. And it is better to plant trees. So yeah, I mean, I think those are enough. Those are a couple of good examples. The book, of course, is a kind of an amazing tour de force that goes through the history of cities and what the potential can be for the future.
You mentioned a little earlier your excitement around a gentleman named Bryn Smith and his
Right.
company Greenwave. Could you tell listeners more about this 3D ocean farming topic, which sounds very 25th century or something?
Well, I hope it's 25th century. Um, well, again, part of what I like about what Brent is doing is his story. He was a commercial fisherman who basically got aced out of the Grand Banks and then out of Bristol Bay in Alaska by all of the problems that you have with overfishing. Then he set himself up as an oysterman in Thimble Islands and Long Island Sound and got wiped out 2 years in a row by Irene and Sandy. And so what he started to do is to look at how he made his living from the sea and say, well, listen, what is a sustainable way to make a living here or to produce food? And the problem with making his living in a time of extreme climate change was that you could get wiped out 2 years in a row by 100-year storms that are not supposed to happen 2 years apart. And what he started to do was to use the leases he had for oysters and create this vertical farming. He's got basically kelp interspersed with mussels and oysters and clams, and producing the kelp grows very quickly with no inputs, and produces this incredibly sort of sweet tasting kelp, if you've ever had it right out of the ocean, that can be used for all kinds of food, from human to animal. And he's figured out how to do this with a minimal investment. So he's also training other people how to secure leases like his and to operate in waters off the East Coast. And so, I think it's exciting on a number of grounds. First of all, what he's doing. Second, how he's propagating it. Third, I like the whole origin of his story and how he learned from the environmental disasters that he faced how to create a new way to make a living.
And it seems almost, I think you mentioned it, you'd written an article on this for the, was it the cleanest line?
Yeah, for
Yes.
our blog, yes.
And I think you said it, it sounds almost too easy or too simple. Just growing food in a column that hangs down from the water. Do you know much about like why this isn't already done? Is it just, it's like one of those things that's so close that people kind of miss it for the larger picture? Or do you know why we haven't been doing this for a longer time?
No, No, I don't. Other than I do know from experience in the clothing business that people tend to get blinders. They do what they know how to do or what they feel expert at doing, and the that is quite possible when people don't know how to do something that they don't try it. Another example is we work with the Bread Lab in the Skagit Valley in Washington. And if you look at farmland in this, I don't know if the figures are for this country or for the world, but 60% of the land is in three crops: it's soy, wheat, and corn. And at the Bread Lab, they've identified 40,000 different grains that could be used, and they have means, without using GMO, means for conventional uh, uh, means of splicing plants that they can tailor these individual grains to particular climates or to particular soil types. And this kind of work hasn't been done before, but I find that tremendously exciting for the same reason. And everybody in agriculture and at the colleges was concentrating on green revolution and concentrating on the use of fertilizers and the use of pesticides. So this is a different approach, and it for some reason it seems to we seem to exhaust every other method before we come up with something that looks promising in a way that actually supports or gives back to nature rather than takes from it.
Yeah, the just a shout out to folks who haven't seen the film Unbroken Ground by Patagonia Provision. It's very powerful. Actually, one of the quotations from Yvonne in the movie has really stuck with me. Yeah, I think he's talking about how nature loves diversity and humans are addicted to monoculture.
Yeah.
I've actually been using that sort of biomimetic analogy in talking about the sort of nascent, or not nascent, but very prominent need to have more diversity and inclusion in businesses. So
right.
the economy itself is more resilient when we have more women and people of color leading businesses. And I sort of made that connection. I mean, I've sort of known it intuitively, but Yvonne really spelled it out when nature actually functions best when it's diverse. So that was really a powerful point.
Yeah. No, it's really true. And I think part of what happened is that when we industrialized and we created factories, that we created processes and came up with this idea of efficiency, which wasn't really a virtue before the 19th century. Jeremy Rifkin has pointed that out. But the problem with efficiency is it usually works in a very closed system. I mean, the oil industry is extremely efficient in the way it drills. But what you have to look at beyond that and say, okay, the problem is that we're using the oil in the first place. So I think that industrialization and the effort to find efficiency tends to drive us toward monoculture because you make things more easily controlled. We still talk. At every conference I go to, people talk about Patagonia, or they talk about things we're doing. They say, "How do you scale that?" And I'm going, "You don't want to scale everything. What you want to do is, for some things, you want to scale them. For many things, you want to be able to replicate them, and then individualize them."
That's really interesting. Replicate and then individualize. At Lift Economy, one of our partners had one of his friends had told him there's a term franchising. So you're almost instead of growing by accretion,
right.
larger, you actually have friends who are sort of regionally adapted models.
Right. Yeah.
So how does that work? Because Patagonia has this opportunity with provisions, like you said, to start from scratch. So let's take your the amazing bars, like the sort of, I think one is it's like mangoes and almonds, or it's like it's a really great mix, right? So you have regeneratively sourced almonds, and I'm not sure if it's mangoes, but we could take that as a hypothetical. Let's say that all 50 states become addicted to your bars. Like, how does what does scaling and then providing that food benefit the economy because you're sourcing it regeneratively, or is it actually then just being a sort of different frame of the existing like scale up culture of sort
Yeah,
of industrializing? Do you know what I'm saying?
I do, and we're not there yet, but you already have this kind of question already comes up when you're dealing with organic agriculture. Um, to take away the word regenerative for a moment. So organic practices are hard enough to do, and Walmart is the largest producer of organic food in the country. And you can go anywhere and get organic carrots that are grown in Mexico. But there's a vast difference between those organic carrots and the carrots that are raised on the experimental plot by stone barns in the Hudson Valley. And the more you get away from that monoculture, the more nutrients you also get into the carrot. So it's a legitimate question. You for a company making prepared food, we haven't reached that point, but at a certain point, yeah, if all of a sudden everybody loved bison jerky, and we've we would have to, I think, provide. You'd have to limit supply and steer people towards something else, especially in food, especially in craft. You can name any number of restaurants in the Bay Area that have gone from 12 tables to 24, and the restaurant's quality is tanked because in expansion, people are unable to do the right thing. If you look at, there's a society called the Honokians. It's made up of 200-year-old companies minimum, and most of them are very small, like traditional ryokans in Japan, that haven't expanded but have kind of perfected their game over 200 years.
It's probably not an easy answer, but is there an heuristic or framework that you use to evaluate when it's time? Like, because Patagonia famously overscaled, I think, in the early '90s, and you had to lay off a bunch of people.
Yeah.
Um, and you've done, I think, a lot of good work to sort of tamp down sort of the amount of different colors and offerings that you guys have offered over the years to not let that happen again. When do you sort of know that it's time to scale versus to like actually stop it and stay smaller? It's probably a difficult question to ask or to answer, but just if you have any thoughts on that.
Actually, it's not so difficult. I think that a lot of times the question is at what rate do you grow? Is the problem for a clothing company. For instance, when we had over 125 factories that we dealt with, you don't even know what you don't even know everybody's face. The relationships are pretty shallow. And part of the idea of going to 45 factories at the time was so that we could deepen the relationship. We could have real conversations about environmental improvements and also conditions on the floor. So if you have two or three excellent factories who are making a product, and then that product becomes very popular, that's happened to us a lot. With better sweaters or with down products, any number of things that become popular. The question is not the absolute limit, but the question is at what rate and what kind of work do you do to bring on a new supplier? I think that's an easier question to answer with an industrial process than it is with an agricultural one, where you're dealing with every place the soil is different, or but in industry, what I see mostly is the question of the rate of change. Same things for a company that cares about values. You want to. One reason not to grow too fast is you can't absorb new people that fast. It takes time for the culture to absorb them and for those new people to feel at home in the culture.
Yeah, and does this resonate at all? I've heard that someone told me once that the rate that the forest grows is 3%, 3 to 4% per year. So I'm just and it's kind of a growth rate that I've for our Force for Good accelerator and fund,
Right.
we've tied the interest or the returns to investors at 3 to 4%, sort of based on that idea of
Right.
like tying it to a living return.
Yeah.
Um, when you mentioned Patagonia, that decision is based on how fast you want to grow. Is there a self-limited rate of growth that Patagonia has? Like, we will not grow any more than 5% a year, or is there a actual number that you guys have used to tap down growth?
No, no, there isn't. And generally, what we've used, I mean, this one of the good things about having a 40-year perspective, because um, I've seen times where Patagonia was growing very quickly, and times when we were hardly growing at all. And I think the key is organic growth. So how much is that growth coming from word of mouth, coming from people who appreciate your products, or how much is the growth coming from making things that your competitor makes that you're going to undercut by 10% and try and sell, or from opening up your distribution to shops who don't know the line very well, or to advertising on the backs of buses in New York City. So I think we've been pretty disciplined for the past 25 years about how we grow, but we haven't set an absolute limit. And in some years, I mean, right after the economic crisis, we were growing pretty rapidly, and I think we were kind of testing the limits of how fast we could absorb people, or how fast we could expand our capacity to get products made.
One other question on growth, because this is just a very fascinating
Sure.
topic, I think, for mission-driven businesses. So this idea of, I remember people tell me a lot of things, and now I'm bringing them up to you. But I was like, why don't people just have zero growth? Like, for example, why doesn't Patagonia say, when we reach $1 billion in sales, we just won't grow anymore? And the person had said, well, you can't really do that because you still need to have new product designs and
Yeah.
then sort of have the ability to hire people. So you can't just say zero growth. But is that actually true? Does that resonate with you? Like, do you need to have at least some to kind of keep some sort of churn happening?
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting question, and we've asked that of ourselves at Patagonia. If I look back to years in which we had almost no growth, they were problematic. They had problems of their own, which was that you couldn't try out new ideas. You couldn't. The people got bored. They weren't moving around within the company. They didn't have new opportunities. And so if you twist the question around a little bit and talk about the Herman Daly example of steady state growth for a whole economy. Now, whether that might be something that would be desirable, but even if you had a greater steady state in the whole economy, it would be made up of things that are growing and things that are dying. I mean, I think that for companies, you might also look at the biological model, that there are going to be product lines in the company that are coming to their conclusion, and that you need new growth to keep the company healthy. Whether a company can, lots of company, it's kind of it is a sacred cow in American business, growth and its value, no less so than for the economy as a whole. But you can look at tons of companies that have actually gone through downsizing, not just of employees, but also of sales, that have eventually come to health or come back in some other way. So I think it's a question that is worth investigating. Could it? And I think if you go back to the question about the Hinoki and these 200-year-old companies. No, they don't grow, but they provide a living for generation after generation. But for a company that operates on an industrial model, that's a tough question.
And you said the Hinokians are in Japan, or there's also a U.S.?
They're all over. No, they're well, obviously not too many in the U.S. because we don't have almost anything that's 200 years old, but there are a bunch in Europe and in Japan.
Got it. Fascinating. So tell me a little bit about what you're doing at Yale. Is there, I imagine one of the things that I've heard from most folks at Patagonia is thank God for the millennials, because otherwise we'd be screwed. So I imagine most of the students that you're working with already believe this sort of idea that business should be, good for all stakeholders, not just shareholders. Are there, what are some of the other trends or ideas or exciting things you've been experiencing at your experience at Yale?
Well, the students are terrific. I tend to get students who are joint students in the environmental school and in the business school. A lot of them have interests in starting their own companies. A lot of them have real questions about what they're going to do when they leave, because they have big loans to repay. In terms of I'm excited about them because I think that they do have the millennials do have a set of values which is I haven't seen since people who grew up in the 60s and 70s, in this desire to, and I hope they do better than we did, this desire to, what the millennials have that we didn't have, what I see in the students at Yale is this tremendous competence and confidence, because they've actually done a lot before they even get to the School of Management. Most of them are making a change of some kind. So I'm excited for them. What I see that's exciting in the world I don't tend to see so much at Yale, tend to see in out in the world, what's going on in organic food, and what's going on with smaller companies like breweries, and B Corps. But it's kind of I see that from a different side.
Speaking of loan forgiveness from Yale, did you know that if they work for a B Corp, they get their loans?
Yes.
Okay, you did know that. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a certain percentage, but it's a good percentage, and they have to work for the B Corp for over time. But I think that's a great move.
Yeah, great. You mentioned some books and other resources that you've been looking to over the past, year or few years. Are there any books or any very exciting things that stand out to you as articles or books that you've read in the last year or so that you would recommend to listeners?
Yeah, well, I mentioned the Well-Tempered City. I'm engaged by the work of John Fullerton at Capital Institute, and he has written a white paper on regenerative capitalism that I find very interesting, because he's actually worked with scientists to find, we a lot of us talk about a systems approach, the need for a systems approach to business, a need for others talk about the need for biomimicry, but I think John is actually, and the people he has worked with have actually set up 8 different principles that healthy systems share, whether biological or of any other kind. and trying to apply these 8 principles to business and to finance. John was a finance guy who came out of J.P. Morgan Chase, reformed banker. And what's refreshing about him is that he knows that world so well, and he also knows its shortcomings and has some ideas on how finance might play a more positive role in the next economy.
Yeah, and actually, you were the one who introduced me to John, and we did an interview with him on this podcast. Yeah. So,
all right.
If anyone's interested, check out I think it's titled "The Emergence of a Regenerative Economy" with John Fullerton. So that was a good one. Speak of this word regenerative, I'm a little worried that it seems to be popping up in a lot of places, almost like sustainability did in the early days. Yeah. And it may be losing, like, for example, I saw that Pepsi is part of a regenerative business coalition. And so, not that that's bad. Well, it just seems to me that it's sort of maybe, I'm not sure people really know what it means. They're just sort of using it because it's a buzzword now. Do you find that that's true or?
Yeah, and it's kind of sad because we're going to lose a good word. I think that the improvement of regenerative over sustainability is that if I look at the kind of fundamental problem that we have with the way we treat nature, is that we are simply not paying back as much as we take. So that in itself means that no matter, we can call ourselves a sustainable, we can have sustainability departments within companies, but what we're doing is not sustainable. The idea of regeneration, I think, is great because it implies exactly that. It says, okay, what are the things we can do that actually will give back more to nature, or will give back more to a community than it takes? So it's a really useful idea. But the word is so attractive that, even within Patagonia, people are using it. I think I saw something, an internal seminar on regenerative management or something like that, and I'm going, oh man, there goes that word.
So. It's funny. One of my college jobs, I worked for Circuit City in like 2004, and this is when high definition TVs came out.
Yeah.
Yeah. And everyone was saying high definition sunglasses and high definition wallpaper, and it's like the original term was very specific to like an image quality, but
gluten free,
right.
Television.
Well, so. I guess it's good if regenerative becomes well enough known that the basic concept that just doing less bad is not working, and that it needs to be a whole systems redesign. I think that would be a good outcome.
And if it illustrates the real problem with sustainability, and the way John uses it is quite correct. And so I think if people actually follow the principles, that will be okay. But we'll see a lot of that word, I think. It's funny, when we wrote the book called The Responsible Company, I talked to Bob Massey, who was one of the people who really started the first CSR reporting methodologies. And he said, back in the day, we were trying to look for a word to replace responsibility, and we thought of sustainability because it would have more meaning. And Emal and I had switched it back to responsibility because we thought that any company could be responsible but could not be sustainable. So
yes. And for those of you who don't know, check out The Responsible Company by Vincent Stanley and Yvonne Chouinard. It's a great book. Yeah, you actually referenced the B-Impact assessment a lot in that book.
Yeah, we did.
In terms of the sort of metrics to measure social and environmental responsibility. So
yeah. And we drew from B-Lab and also from the Napa, originally the Napa Vintners, and then Napa County came up with a really great checklist for more agricultural practices, and so we borrowed from both and put them in the framework.
Let's talk briefly about your involvement in the Footprint Chronicles. Maybe at first, can you just describe what it is for folks who don't know, and then how how it came about to be a full-fledged program within Patagonia?
Yeah, its origins. I just mentioned Bob Massey. So s- large public corporations started to issue corporate social responsibility reports in the 1990s, and there were various methodologies for producing those. One of them was GRI, and there were formats that companies could use to create these. And so the company asked me to create one, which I did in 2003. And we produced it and we looked at it, and I did my best, but this is not the way we wanted to talk to our customers. It was really dry, and it might have worked out in a few years, but we had very little baseline information, and it was terrible storytelling. So what we said is let's go back and take 5 products and really talk about, from the field or the oil well, the development of that fabric all the way to the creation of the product and to the shipment to our warehouse in Reno. And so we did that, and we used a device that we don't use now, but I thought it was a great way to frame it, and it worked very well for us for a while. Called what we like. So we talked about what we were proud of in the terms of that product, what we don't like, what we saw as problematic, usually either environmental or social, and third, what we think, which was an assessment of where we would go next, or where we would try to go next with the product. And it got a lot of attention. We eventually built it up to cover a lot more than the first 5 products. We went to 15, and then we had metrics on up to a couple of hundred products. There were some benefits to it that I didn't expect. We knew when we produced it that it would be of interest to customers, that it would be of interest to NGOs. A couple of things that were a surprise to me. One is that it really helped with employees. It actually helped the conversation. And I can attest to this personally, because I'd been involved on the marketing and sales side of the business for, at that time, over 30 years. And I knew very little about, because work has blinkered, even in a company like Patagonia, I knew very little about how we made our clothes, what the processes were. So I think we created a common language in the company about our own environmental and social work in making the products, and it made all the conversations smarter. So we still had disagreements, we still had tensions, but those were at a higher level than they were before, after we introduced Footprint Chronicles. Another surprise was that suppliers came to use it, and they wanted to, when we cited that some supplier had a problem and then made an improvement, they loved that. And other companies, actually suppliers, wanted to be listed on the Footprint Chronicles. So I haven't been involved with it for the past couple of years. I think we are going through another process of revising it.
And just that original desire to be transparent, I still know. I cannot think of another company that has copied you. You probably know of other companies that have, but even B Corps that I talk to, who are completely intellectually aligned with Patagonia, are very afraid of competitors taking their suppliers away.
Interesting. Yeah.
Or the potential risks, right? There is still a theoretical downside of, oh my gosh, this supplier, turns out that they were using,
right.
And it's funny because Patagonia it still happens at Patagonia, like with Ovis 21, and
right.
Rick Ridgeway had talked about finding out, I think last year, about some tier 2 suppliers that in Taiwan
Right.
that had, forced indentured servants almost. So
Right.
it's not like having this makes it go away, but I think your transparency um, almost gives you credibility. It's like, this is a problem and here's what we're going to do to fix it.
Right.
And it seems like most people are just afraid to even have the conversation.
I think that's true, and I actually believe really strongly in this, that companies should talk both about the things that they've figured out how to do that are very good, and also be upfront about changes that people can't yet figure out how to make, or upfront about problems. And partly, I think, I think in Patagonia's case, it has provided a bit of inoculation, because I think that the people trust us based on the credibility that we've shown over time. But I would argue that for almost any company that's trying to do something new, is that they should make known. I mean, there's a famous story I learned 10 years ago that Dunkin' Donuts uses Fairtrade coffee. Okay. But they don't advertise it, because they don't think that that's going to be important to their customer. Well, Dunkin' Donuts, in the size they are, can do fair trade coffee. I think they should have been talking about that. And the problems that we have, both social and environmental, that we're going to have to be dealing with over the next 30 to 35 years, really require a level of engagement and a level of conversation that's much higher than the one we have now. And if companies don't do this, people are going to continue to be in the dark and think that their products somehow, magically arrive on the shelf on the store, when in fact there's a very complicated process to bring that product to the market.
In the last few 5 to 10 minutes here, one of the things I've always been interested in is, with Yvonne as the sole owner, some companies have said, oh, we could be more socially and environmentally responsible, but we can't be like Patagonia because it's just, Yvonne and Melinda who own it. And this is the last time, I promise, that I'll say I heard something, but I have heard that one idea and response that Yvonne had at some point about a worker ownership, or allowing allowing some more worker ownership, was that he had thought about it, but he decided that in order to stay as radically activist as Patagonia is, he was afraid that selling, or like having some of the employees be owners, that it would actually make the company slightly more conservative. Is that apocryphal, or is that a true?
No, that's true.
Okay.
And it's interesting. I'm philosophically drawn to cooperatives and to worker-owned companies, but I think that what I've seen and what I've heard is it's not you can get a more conservative attitude from the corporation. I mean, people forget that United Airlines for a while was owned by its employees, and it didn't really operate any differently as a company when it was employee owned as it did when it was owned by shareholders. So I remember, even in the very early days of the company, at some point there was discussion of the management of the company buying the Chenards out. And I remember being nervous at that time about that conversation, because I thought, oh no, the simplicity of the ownership of the Chenards, when they decide something, they go out and do it. You've got a lot of managers who are trying to agree to something and then preserving the company as an institution, kind of primarily, that you will start to get more conservative behavior. So I don't think it was an illegitimate concern.
And I guess it sounds like the transition plan is his children will take over. Is that
Right.
correct? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're in the process.
Yeah. And luckily it will, the benefit corporation is one great way to ensure that mission stays in place for the next 100 years.
No, that's huge for us. By the way, just to mention this, when I talk to, and I'm sure you probably do the same thing when you talk to entrepreneurs who are thinking about becoming B Corps, and people ask me this in business schools all the time: when should I incorporate my values into my business? And I tell them right at the beginning that I think they should become a B Corp right at the beginning, because I think it's much harder after you've operated for a couple of years. I think people have the idea, well, I'll be able to afford becoming a B Corp, when in fact, after a couple of years of operation, if you have to persuade your employees, you have to persuade your investors, you have to, in some cases, persuade your customers that this is a valuable move. It's much easier to do that at the beginning, when it's baked right into the DNA of the company.
Can folks go to learn more about your work and Footprint Chronicles or any of the other projects you're currently involved with?
Well, the Patagonia website is encyclopedic, and that's a good place to go. And for some of the other things we've talked about, I recommend the capitalinstitute.org website. A couple of other things that we've talked about, if people are interested, if they go to a website for the Yale Center for Business and Environment, they have ongoing programs that I think are really that are interesting. People want to follow this.
Well, thank you so much, Vincent. It's been incredibly amazing to speak with you.
Well, thank you, Ryan. It's been my pleasure. Great to speak with you.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our past episodes, visit www.lifteconomy.com. You can also subscribe to this podcast in iTunes, Overcast, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcast. Once again, thanks for listening.